Tá tudo no coração, melodia e percussão. A música afasta o medo e faz a mobilização. Pra quem vai o seu amém, pra quem julga e machuca. Pra quem vai o seu amém, pra quem sobrevive e luta. Pra quem vai o seu amém, pra quem julga e machuca. Pra quem vai o seu amém, pra quem sobrevive e luta. Lembro dos nomes que inspiram, na nossa voz são eternos. Sempre de cabeça erguida, a nossa luta revive. Lembro do som da quebrada, do brilho dos nossos sonhos. O som derruba muralhas e o nosso grito não para.
Hello everyone, good evening. Whoa, okay. I know it's like that weird moment we've been waiting too long, but good evening. Okay. Welcome to our opening night and our opening event to this 3-day symposium on anti-Black state violence across the Americas, power and struggle in Brazil and the US. Over the course of these 3 days, we are going to be in conversation with some of the most influential scholars, scholar activists, and organizers from Brazil and the United States, which is home to the 2 largest Black populations outside of the continent of Africa. This is a very powerful event, and we're all very happy to have you here. This event was primarily organized by a multidisciplinary group of graduate students. This really big event was graduate students. We call ourselves the LUTA initiative. I am one of the directors of this particular event of the initiative, along with Jessica Compton, my co-director over here, and with really important guidance from Professor Tiana Paschal. I'm not going to steal the mic for too long because we have some really amazing speakers, but I really want to emphasize 2 main things. This event is extremely historic and unprecedented for many reasons, and I'm going to name 2. One is never in the history of UC Berkeley have so many sponsors, so many centers, institutes, and departments supported an event with a title that has the word anti-Black violence in it. Never mind the added words of power and struggle. Secondly, never in the history of UC Berkeley have we had such sustained use of simultaneous interpretation for an event of this scale. Our graduate student team started organizing this thinking that it was pretty normal to have simultaneous interpretation. And over the course of the organizing, realized that it's extremely uncommon. In fact, most of the events require that presenters from other countries be English speakers. So this is an extremely important event, and hopefully one of the first of many, where we are pushing further boundaries at the university to no longer restrict conversations to the English-speaking world and the concepts that are translated through them. So, we've done a lot of work to get simultaneous interpretation happening, and so I have one more comment about this. LUTA does not see simultaneous interpretation as a logistical component of this project. This is at the heart of what we're trying to think through. If we're actually going to have transnational dialogue and think cross-nationally through different experiences and identities, we need to have translation at the center, and that means wrestling and thinking together with our interpreters about what the best words are and what words are harmful and not, right? And that's a process that we are inviting our interpreters to be a part of. And so this is a really important push for us to think through all of the future events, to think together about transnationalism and what that truly means when we're wanting to think together about experiences and develop coalitions in the future. So that's my spiel. And now I'm going to be very pleased to introduce you to Professor Eula Taylor to give you some real welcoming remarks. Eula Taylor earned her doctorate in American history from UC Santa Barbara. She's a professor and department chair of the Department of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. She is the author of The Promise of Patriarchy, Women and the Nation of Islam, The Veiled Garvey, The Life and Times of Amy Jacques Garvey, co-author of Panther, A Pictorial History of the Black Panther Party and the Story Behind the Film, and co-editor of Black California Dreamin', The Crisis of California African American Communities. Her articles on African American women's history and feminist theory have appeared in the Journal of African American History, Journal of Women's History, Feminist Studies, Souls, and other academic journals and edited volumes. In 2013, she received the Distinguished Professor Teaching Award for the University of California, Berkeley. Only 5% of the academic Senate faculty receive this honor, and she is the second African American woman in the history of the university to receive this award. Thank you, Professor Taylor, for your remarks.
Thank you so much. Good evening, early evening. So glad all of you are here. I want to begin with a tradition that's very, very important across the Americas, and that is the pouring of libation. And so I've asked my former student, Rashid Shabazz, to come up and to pour libations to open up this conversation and to recognize all of those who have gone before us. So Rashid.
Thank you, Dr. Bismillah. All right, assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
Peace be with you all. So before I begin the libation and explain the process, as I was taught, you have to first ask for permission. So may I continue? All right, thank you. So this libation is a practice that I grew up seeing, but I didn't understand in my community. Because people, after the death of a loved one, we would take intoxicating beverage and pour it out on the concrete, pour it out on the street. And I later came to learn that this was something that was called libation, and it was something to honor our ancestors. It's a practice to bring them here in the space, to honor them, and to really utilize the energy and the force and the power that they've used to bring us here at this point in this struggle. And so as I continue, in my tradition, we start giving thanks to the Creator. And this Creator may be known by many names. In mine, we say Allah. Some people say Elohim. Some people may say Yemaya or attributes like Shango. And so in the name of the higher power, by whichever name, we call it, we pour the libation and say Ashe. Now, Ashe is a word that means so it is. And so may the words have power. And we pour the water because it is something which our planet is primarily made of, our bodies are primarily made of, and this water can vibrate with those words, that energy and that intention. And so moving on from the Creator, we will often do it in the 4 directions to give thanks to the ancestors that came from those different directions, and in particularly being here on the Ohlone people's land, we recognize the 4 directions. So I'll start with the east, and we'll pour it and say Ashe. And we'll go to the south, just a little bit, Ashe. And to the north, Ashe. And here in Berkeley in the west, Ashe. And going back to the first human beings, and I'm not going to get into the whole thing about Cro-Magnons and all of that, but thinking about what some people will call the Adam or Adamite people, and some people think about Lucy, or what some people call, or who some people call Dinknesh. Whatever the names, your understanding of our first human beings, likely all of our common ancestors, pour this and say Ashe.
Ashe.
And I want to be more specific to folks in the African diaspora, because we're talking about state violence against black folks in the Americas, thinking of the Africans who had to experience what they say in Swahili, the Maafa, or the Black Holocaust. And so for those who were stolen, stripped, and taken from their land and forcibly brought here and did not survive the Middle Passage, those that did not make it here, pour this and say Ashe. Ashe. And for those who did survive, who made it here, regardless of where the boat dropped you off, whether it was in Bahia or whether it was in South Carolina or Virginia, wherever the boat dropped you off, we came here, we survived plantations and Jim Crow. We survived through in other places like the Great Dismal Swamp and maroon communities and quilombos and fighting this violence. For those that survived and attempted to thrive, we pour this and say Ashe.
Ashe.
And so to not take too much time, just want to give you a quick moment to say the name of an ancestor you would like to bring here in this space today. And I'll start by saying Barbara Christian. Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Say their names. Ashe. Say their names. Ashe. Clyde Woods. Ashe. 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 And so for all those whose names we will never even know, we'll pour this and say Ashe.
Ashe.
And just lastly, in the hopes that our descendants will remember us. So years from now, that they will remember our names and want us to be present with them. Pour this 3 times and say Ashe. Ashe.
Ashe.
Ashe. Ashe. And so it is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rashid. You know, I have to tell you, I so wanted to begin my opening remarks with libation, and I said to Shanika, who I was walking down here with, I said, I'm going to bring my plant. I said, because it's going to be somebody in this room who knows how to open up this conversation and bring all the people who can't be with us, their spirit in this room with us this evening. Again, my name is Eula Taylor, and I have the distinct honor to welcome all of you to what promises to be an unprecedented symposium that focuses on anti-Black state violence. As the chair of the Department of African American Studies, my colleagues and I are constantly thinking about and reflecting upon this critical social and political moment in the world, and how violence and all forms of repression against marginalized communities has pinned so many of us against a wall. This symposium, Anti-Black State Violence Across the Americas, Power and Struggle in Brazil and the US, gives us an opportunity to think beyond our particular enclave, cohort, comrades, in an effort to advance scholarship and concrete action related to all forms of violence. Each day has a guiding theme: America's faces, America's roots, America's futures. And what I loved is that the organizers created 3 different posters. You know, and so if you saw the 3 different posters, you might have been thinking, is this all one symposium? It is, and this is what makes it so cutting edge and so powerful and so on the edge of possibilities. Each day, America's faces, America's roots, America's futures. This evening engages America's faces, which opens up an important conceptual mission of the symposium: Black and brown social political experiences as the site of human possibilities, power, and action. America's faces will serve as a springboard for cross-national dialogues about anti-Black state violence across the Americas. All of the varied experiences and identities of Blackness will be explored, as well as how different geographical locations require different forms of scholarships and different forms of transnational coalitions. The reason that we are gathered here, as well as tomorrow and as well as Saturday, is because of a group of dynamic graduate students here at UC Berkeley. They come from a variety of departments: African American Studies, Anthropology, Education, Geography, Spanish and Portuguese, and Sociology. And they have brought together all of their eclectic experiences to forge LUTA. It's hard to believe that this is the first collective project of LUTA. So clearly they are a powerful, dynamic collective dedicated to critical thinking and action. My colleague, Professor Tiana Pichel, has been very important in supporting and guiding all of their efforts. And so we want to show love and appreciation to all of the organizers. Now, one always has to conclude opening remarks by acknowledging all of the sponsors of the event. I want to thank all of the sponsors of the event. They're listed on just about everything. So you can take another look at your handout, you could take another look at one of the 3 posters, and you can recognize all of the forces that have brought us here this evening. Now I want to turn the mic over to our keynote speaker, my colleague, Professor John Powell. Professor Powell is an internationally recognized expert in the areas of civil rights and civil liberties, and a wide range of issues including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. In addition to being a professor of law and a professor of African American Studies and Ethnic Studies here at UC Berkeley, Professor Powell holds the Robert D. Haas Chancellor Chair in Equity and Inclusion. He is also the executive director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society, which supports research to generate specific prescriptions for changes in policy and practices that address disparities related to race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, disability, and social economics in California and nationwide. He has written extensively on a number of issues, including structural racism, racial justice, concentrated poverty, and urban sprawl, voting rights, affirmative action in the United States, and the need of citizens in a democratic society to understand their power. His most recent of many books, Racing to Justice, Transforming Our Conceptions of Self and Other to Build an Inclusive Society, was published in 2015, and it challenges us to replace attitudes and institutions that promote and perpetuate social suffering with those that foster relationships and a way of being that transcends disconnections and separations. So I'm going to turn the mic over to John Powell, and then thereafter we all have the opportunity to watch and witness an amazing film. Professor Powell.
Good evening. I think I may have too many mics. So it's really great to be part of this inaugural event. And I think in terms of the work that the students have actually demonstrated, it gives us reason to actually believe that they're building, that you're building, that we're building a bridge to the future. And let me just tell you a little bit more about myself. I was part of a research team, a 3-year project that looked at, among other things, racism in the United States, Brazil, and South Africa. It was actually a fabulous project. There were 2 researchers from each country, and we went around and made some comparison. And out of that came a book called Beyond Racism, written by Lynn Huntley, who passed away some time ago. It was interesting reading the book, because now the book is a little dated. I think it came out in 2001, so I want to know, what was I thinking in 2001? But it's interesting to read about the comparison between those 3 countries, because as it suggested, Brazil, the United States, and then you throw in South Africa, have the most, not only the largest population, South Africa being in Africa, but of sort of oppressive anti-Black racism as an expression in the world. I'm also part of this project, which is actually bringing 40 or 50 scholars together, looking at issues about anti-black racism. So I want to just start off by commending the organizers, because most of the time, at least in the United States, we have a hard time saying race. Our mouths are not even structured to say racism. You know, we choke when we say racism. And to say anti-black racism, you must be a radical. It must be, anti-black racism. But when we think about racism in the Americas, and I would say in Europe, it really is organized largely, not exclusively, but largely around anti-blackness. And so when we talk about anti-black state violence, it informs, getting some feedback, it informs not only what's happening, again, in the United States, but what's happening throughout Western society. Anthony Marks was part of that group that went to South Africa, Brazil, and the United States. He wrote a book called Making Race, Making Nation. His argument is that the nation state, which is not that old, the nation state was largely about making race. And it's interesting because the nation state is undergoing a lot of stresses right now. As an organizing principle, it's under tremendous stress. And part of that stress is because the nation state, again, not just the United States, not just Brazil, but England, Germany, Australia, we could even throw in India. The nation state is actually trying to come to terms with how it makes people, how it makes race, who is the we, who belongs. And the deep relationship between racial identity and racial belonging and the nation state is actually being called into question. And so what you're seeing in terms of the expression that comes from Trump, that comes from Moda, that comes from the BRICS, that comes all over the world, is the notion that the we in the nation state, the people in the nation state, needs to be a narrow, monolithic we. And so you see a resurgence of people making. When I'm suggesting it, that states have been very closely tied to people making. And the people making, as conceived in South Africa, as conceived in the United States, as conceived in Brazil, the people that were being made were largely white. And so whiteness was about who can belong to the nation state. In the United States, this took expression, right, in terms of not only the Civil War, but one of the most famous cases in the United States, Dred Scott, when the U.S. Supreme Court said blacks could never be part of the political community. We can't imagine blacks being part of the political community. The expression in South Africa was very similar. And the two biggest wars in South Africa and the United States was fought around the question as to who could belong. Now, a lot of people thought Brazil was the exception because Brazil did not have the same kind of inter-white fight as you had in South Africa and the United States. And Brazil never imposed legalized segregation. And in fact, Brazil suggested a notion of racial democracy. And instead of having the hard binary that the United States had and the one-drop rule, Brazil had multiracialism and many different categories. And in my chapter, Beyond Racism, I said Brazil represented not racial democracy as it claimed, but a pigmentocracy, where it rated people not on one drop of blood, but on your skin color. And so the lighter you became, the higher you moved up into the social hierarchy. Now, there are other ways to move up there, not just skin color, also socioeconomic status. But this has turned out not to be a racial democracy, but a new form of exclusion. And so you still have the hierarchy with just greater gradations. And you had migration. So that literally when we went to Brazil and talked to people who were darker-skinned people and talked to them about racial discrimination against blacks, we had people saying things like, and some of these people were very prominent, some were athletes, some of them were movie stars, some of them were in politics, and they would say, well, I could believe there's anti-black racism in Brazil because when I used to be black, but I'm no longer black. And they weren't just being facetious. They were saying that there, as they say, money whitens. So the more money you had, the whiter you became, the social role shifted, which made issues of black solidarity more difficult. Because every time you got someone who was potentially successful, who could begin to use the knowledge you get here at Berkeley, or the knowledge you get, the power you get from these different places, the person would also have an escape hatch. You no longer have to be black. You can identify as something other than black. Now, what you're going to be dealing with in this conference is anti-black violence. I want to suggest a couple of things. That's actually a very important but also very complicated subject. I was teaching a class several years ago, and I started off the class in terms of taking indigenous land in the United States. And some of my white students at some point, I forget what the name of the class was, it wasn't a class about Native people. It wasn't a class about indigenous people. So one of the white students raised his hand and he said, Professor Powell, why do we have to study the history of Native Americans? That's not what this course is about. And my response was, we're not. We know nothing about Native Americans. This is the history of the United States. This is your history. This is your origin story. It starts with taking the land of a people and enslaving another people. Now, the land that you take tells you nothing about the people. The people you enslave tells you nothing about those people. It tells you about yourself. It tells you this is your origin story. So really, every white American, every white Brazilian needs to understand slavery, not because you're going to understand Africa, but it's the origin story of Brazil. It's the origin story of the United States. And so part of the turn in terms of understanding anti-black violence is that anti-black violence is about both state building. This is how we build a state. This is how we constitute a nation. By first of all, being clear on who's excluded. We draw boundaries, not by just who's in, but who's out, and those who are in, how we exclude and exploit some in favor of others. So in terms of understanding anti-black violence, I would posit that what we're really studying is whiteness. We're really studying the construction of whiteness. Whiteness is about anti-blackness. And sometimes things are more explicit than others. So if you look at early Virginia texts, Virginia is maybe the most important colony in the United States in terms of slavery, and most of the early presidents from Jefferson on all came from Virginia. And we're getting ready to acknowledge the 400th anniversary of slaves coming to the United States. And despite what the governor of Virginia said, they were not indentured servants, they were slaves. But when you read, it's interesting, part of the complexity is the nation state had not formed, and the nation state didn't have an official role, so it was kind of messy. So in that sense, you could give the governor a little slack. It's like the state had not really formed yet. It was in the process of forming. But that's the point, that the process of nation building was also the process of black making. Blackness as a social identity had not been constructed. It was in the process of being constructed. And if blackness as a social identity had not been constructed, it meant whiteness as a social identity had not been constructed. So the indigenous Europeans who came over, they were not white. whiteness was being constructed. And that construction took a long time. It was nothing natural about that construction. And eventually what Virginia said, literally, is that whiteness is not blackness. One of the early definitions of, so who's white? It means you're not black. That's what it means. Whiteness was derivative and reactive to whiteness, to blackness. And it still is. And so really what we're studying when we study anti-black violence, anti-state violence, we're studying whiteness, the construction of whiteness. And the hard edge, I believe, in terms of getting to a new place where this violence is not so dominant, means a reconstruction of whiteness. A reconstruction of whiteness. And I always hasten this when I say this because it sounds harsh. And it is harsh. But we're not talking about people who are phenotypically light-skinned. We're talking about an ideological social position of whiteness, which only existed at the same time that we were constructing the nation state. We constructed the nation state, especially in the United States, Brazil, and in Europe, for whites by excluding blacks. And what we're seeing now, at this moment in the United States, in Brazil, in England, in much of the world, is whites basically claiming a disruption because these immigrants who are not white, and we could say the colonialists in Europe and the United States, blacks and Latinos are claiming to be part of the we. So we've never had a healthy expression of society where blacks and whites were in concert with each other. Not because of blackness, but because of whiteness. And it's not clear to me that whiteness can coexist in a democracy with blackness. And I don't mean that in people who are phenotypically white and people who are phenotypically black. I mean the ideology of whiteness cannot necessarily coexist with blackness. Now think about this. So we have slavery, and then slavery ends, or at least it changes, because we move very quickly in the United States to sharecropping. And we have new mechanisms to contain the apparently free blacks. And as someone said, even though the North won the Civil War in the United States, and blacks won the war in South Africa, and Brazil didn't have a war, the most virulent whites actually prevail. So the laws of segregation, the laws of anti-miscegenation, the laws of disinvestment, the laws of policing people, the laws of racial profiling, all come from the southern expression of whiteness in the United States, the most virulent whites in Brazil, and the Afrikanders in South Africa. So they lost the war, but they're winning the social construct. Trump is not, to use just to name it, Trump is not a descendant of Lincoln. He's a descendant of Jefferson Davis. And I sometimes say in the United States, we're fighting the Civil War, it's no longer a Civil War. It's a national war, and the South is winning. And winning in Wisconsin, winning in Michigan, winning in California, winning in Brazil. Now again, it's important just when talking about this to sort of think about blackness in a different way, to think about whiteness in a different way, and to think about state violence in a different way. Because the most extreme form of state violence that we think about is police or the military going into favela, actually beating up people and arresting people, going into Ferguson with tanks. But the violence happened before that. Because we have segregation, and people sometimes don't understand this. I just read a report saying that in the United States, the most segregated population are whites. And I think that's problematic for a couple of reasons. Because segregation has never just meant separating people based on their phenotype. Segregation is about the distribution of opportunity and resources. And so when blacks are segregated, they're not segregated in a space where there are good schools. They're not segregated where there's grocery stores. They're not segregated where there are roads. They're not segregated where there's high-speed internet. They're segregated from opportunity. They're segregated from resources. So the segregation, when you think about it that way, is a way of distributing largely state-sponsored resources so that one group has it and another group doesn't have it. And the reason that's important is because when people say whites are segregated, they're drawing unprincipled symmetry between whites and blacks. I'm separated from you, you're separated from me. But where I'm separated, I don't have any resources. I don't have water to drink. I don't have food to eat. I don't have schools and roads. And you have all those things. So if we're going to be segregated, I want your segregation, not mine. And so part of what's happening is the hoarding of privilege. It's the hoarding of resources. It's the hoarding of identity itself. So whiteness then becomes associated with good neighborhoods, with good schools, with clean water, with espresso coffee. And then that gets seared into our mind. So the violence then happens not just in terms of the police, but the violence happens in terms of keeping people isolated from resources. And I did a study several years ago on racial profiling. And everyone assumed that racial profiling was the most extreme in black communities, in Brazil, in South Africa, in the United States, because those communities had more crime and those communities had more drug dealing. It turns out that was not the case. It turns out the most high expression of racial profiling was when blacks wandered into white neighborhoods. What the police were really doing was keeping people contained for the benefit of another people. So they're already in prison, if you will, even if they can move around. And at some point, it's like, okay, you got out of your space. So I've literally been stopped by police and they said, what are you doing here? You're too close to opportunity. How'd you get so close to opportunity? What happened? This is a white space. And I know I worked on the affirmative action in South Africa and Brazil. And some of what I worked on 20 years ago was eventually adopted. Not necessarily like I suggested it. That's fine. But there's now this thing about, well, those people don't really belong in schools, and this is a quota system, and now they're really black, and so there's this attack on affirmative action. And it's another way of saying when black people show up in halls of knowledge, in sites of power, their presence is being questioned. And when whites show up, there's an assumption that they belong there. This is a natural place for whites to be. And then there's a whole narrative around they earned it. They studied hard, they did well on test scores, they earned it. And I sometimes jokingly say they don't realize, they think they deserve it, they don't realize they just happen to be the white person at the white place at the white time. So let me end by saying just two things. This is a global phenomenon. There are different expressions in different histories, and we can learn from each other. But it's not unique. There's something globally happening. And we need to actually bring into the discussion the notion of whiteness and challenge that, because that is where, at the intersection of whiteness and blackness, that's where the violence happened. That's what and I don't mean, again, people who are phenotypically white. If you look at the young man who was killed by the police in Baltimore, some people get confused and say, well, 3 of the 5 police were police of color. So it couldn't be racism. So it's not that just people who are phenotypically white can be engaged in a white ideology and white oppression. So this is the challenge, to sort of think about this more globally, to think about how these concepts of whiteness and blackness not only show up in terms of how we police our bodies, but how we police space, how we police knowledge, how we police resources, how we police social institutions. And if we move beyond that, what does it look like? If we were to destabilize whiteness so that it wasn't so pernicious, it wasn't so dangerous, it wasn't so, at the same time, vicious and fragile at the same time, then what does it look like? Actually, we don't know. We have no idea of what whiteness would look like that really was inclusive, that really didn't need to dominate, that really wasn't predicated on separation and violence. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge. And there's a beautiful quote, and I'll give it to you. It's by Malcolm X, and he says, we need to go to a space where no people dominate, not one or the other. And he said, for people, we need to go to a space where people care about each other's freedom. He said, when we do that, it will not be based on race. So again, I think what you're doing is really important. You're part of something that is global. You're part of something that's very serious, because if we don't get this right, I don't believe we survive as a people. To sort of think about, not just historically, but this bridge to the future. So what does it look like if we get beyond anti-black violence? What if we get beyond whiteness? What if we get beyond a notion where any group, racially or otherwise, need to dominate? And the distribution of resources are fairly, justly distributed among people. That's the challenge, and I'm concerned, but I'm not worried. I'm not worried because you're here, and because you're embracing these questions, and because we can get to, and we have to get to, a different and better future. So thank you for having this conference. I was told to remind you, after things open, there's going to be this film, and I think it's, I don't know if you want to come up and.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. All right, well, thank you, Professor Powell. Round of applause. Okay, so thank you, Professor Taylor. So we are gonna go, I'm hooked up, so that's for the audience. So we're gonna go ahead and do a little bit of a Q&A if you'd like. So I'm gonna go ahead and just start with a question, and then we're gonna open it to the audience, but let's get this going a little bit. I felt like the audience most certainly agreed with lots of what you said. And the theme for this kickoff was sort of, what do we face, right? If we're really talking about anti-Black state violence, what is it that we have to face? That means both within us, but when we look at each other. So, though many of us could agree with what you said, what do you do? How do you face a population of white people who don't know about themselves? What is involved in bringing consciousness to whiteness? How do we even begin to think about the what? Mm-hmm. It seems like many of us agree with perhaps the why, which you gave, rooted in history. What do we do? What are some of the do's?
Sure. Great question. Let me tell you a real situation that just happened here in the United States. We worked, the Haas Institute, along with others, we worked on this last election, and we worked in several states. One of the states we worked in was Florida. And we worked on voter restoration. I'm sure many of you have heard of that now, voter restoration effort in Florida. Desmond Meade was the head of that effort. Desmond is African American. And in order to restore votes in Florida, you have to get 60% of the vote. And what Desmond said, he said, there are not enough Black and Latino voters in Florida to get to 60%. And so what he said in response to your question, he's saying we have to actually reach out to white voters as well. And we can't get to 60% unless we do that. So he actually hired as his political director a white guy who was from rural Florida, who has returning from prison, returning citizen, that was a Trump supporter. Now, the good news is they not only won, they got to 60%, they got to 65%. As a result of that, you're having the largest enfranchisement in American history since 1920. The last time we saw such a large enfranchisement of Americans was when women got the right to vote in 1920. But the point is, he basically told a story that, in a sense, invited whites into a relationship where, no, you don't get to dominate, but neither do we get to dominate. And now, 1.4 million people who couldn't vote can now vote. And how do you actually then build, not take that, we don't want them just to vote, how do you actually construct a new we, where they don't see their life chances in direct opposition to blacks and brown people? That's been happening all over the country, and that's big and it's small at the same time. So that's the how. We actually come up with a vision, and we talk about it at the Institute in terms of bridging and breaking. How do you actually bridge with people to say we actually share a common future? And that future actually requires that no one dominates. Not you, not us, that we do something together, we build the future together. We actually know a fair amount of how to do that. We don't do it very often. So I think there are many different expressions of that. And we've had some really incredible victories in this last election and beyond. So I would say as we fight, sometimes as we sort of fight anti-black violence, and as we fight whiteness, we do it in a way that actually exclude whites altogether. Yeah. We don't give them a path out of their whiteness. Now, they may not take the path. That's a different question. But it seems King used to have this thing that when people ask him about the racists in the South, he said, I'll leave the door open and I'll leave the light on. They can come. I'm not going to go chasing them. Right. But if they want to come, they can come. Sometimes we get so mad at white people. It's like, if they come, I'm beating them up. They better not show up in my neighborhood. And so I'm not saying that our project is mainly about saving white people, but I am saying our project does require us moving beyond whiteness. And I think you're basically knowledge producers. So there needs to be a new vocabulary, because most people, certainly in the United States, and I would say in Brazil, occupy race as an essential thing. Yeah. Even though it changes all the time, we actually act like it can never change. Or we act like it can only change when capitalism and patriarchal and homophobia and xenophobia all die. It's like, oh, what is that? It's like, and all those things should die. But we can actually make progress before they die, and making progress will help them die. So we don't wait until capitalism ends. We don't wait until homophobia ends. We don't wait until patriarchy ends. We can do stuff now. We can do stuff like they did in Florida.
Thank you for that answer. I think one thing that I really appreciate in your response was providing, especially many of the young people here, the concept of balance, that not every white person is going to come along, and that you don't have to give every inch of yourself to try to get them, right, because they just might not. And time will go on, and things will pass, and they will also pass, and a new generation will rise. And I know from my talks with many young people, from teaching at Berkeley, some of that frustration happens, right? We want this positive change, and so I really appreciate that. And now we absolutely want to open it up to the audience. Please feel free to introduce yourself, and we're hoping to stick just to questions. We know that many of you have many reflections, and we're absolutely going have opportunities to hear more of those. So any questions for Mr. Powell? Why don't we start? We'll start up there and then go here. Okay, great. Yeah, right there in the white shirt. We'll bring you a microphone.
Hi, thank you for your talk. My name is Marwan. I'm from Egypt, like an African country with very pervasive anti-blackness in it. And I was wondering, because you attributed the dichotomy between whiteness and blackness to nation making, how much would you attribute it to very pernicious profit incentives that has catalyzed race making? And because I would also say that a lot of this anti-blackness in Egypt was planted with through European imperialism in Egypt, which was motivated by these profit incentives and has definitely hurt a lot of black people in Egypt, especially the Nubians. So yeah, the whole nation building and profit incentive.
So if I understand your question, how much of it is related to profit making and in that sense you're getting to say capitalism? I would say it's very much related, but there's good news and bad news. So if you look at, there's a book called Against the Grain, and basically the person's writing about moving from hunter-gatherers to agricultural society. And he talks about how as we move to agricultural societies, the elites, not in a racialized way, but the elites wanted to figure out a way of how to control the crops that other people were growing. And the elites was fairly small, anywhere from 2 to 5% of people who moved to the city, and all of a sudden they're not growing anymore. So they have to tax people, they have to extract resources from them, and they're going to do that. And an early expression of that was not specifically on race. So the fact that people will organize and extract things from each other, and more recently race has become a very powerful tool to do that, should not be surprising. And yes, one of the things that's important in what you're suggesting is that there's a book called Rules of Racialization by Steve Martinot. And his point is that whiteness was the middle stratum, that the elites in Europe did not consider themselves white. So when they constructed early construction of whites, that was the middle stratum, that was the workers. And they did it to actually do better extract, but also to manage the growing black population and to separate. And it didn't happen automatically. It didn't happen in a minute. It took a while for them to figure that stuff out. And so the middle stratum was given a role to police the non-whites. But the middle stratum were never the elites. And that's important because sometimes when we talk about race, we leave the elites out of the question. And so the elites was, yes, how do we make sure we have as much profit as possible? You think about the Civil War, whites in the North and whites in the South are fighting each other, and blacks get caught up in that, and they use it. So that's part of the dynamic. And in that way, capitalism or extraction of resources are very much part of it. But there's another part that's also the case. I still do a lot of work in South Africa. And South Africa is going through some hard times. And part of the elites in South Africa now are people who are phenotypically black. And it's actually confusing a lot of the activists in South Africa because they're used to fighting people who are phenotypically white. That's what anti-apartheid was about. But now they have black people or India. And it's like, wait a minute, they're the same as we are. And I say, no, they're not. Do you think that the Queen of England, when she was extracting stuff from the serfs, was thinking, I'm extracting stuff from my own people? So in a sense, we had fallen into the trap of naturalizing race and instead of understanding how it's being used. So I think we have to do that and not, so yes, that's part of it. But part of the reason that was effective, or part of the reason they did that is because if Europeans and Africans came together, that's a very powerful coalition. And then you could actually redistribute how we actually think about those resources. And so the elites have a vested interest in making sure that does not happen.
Peace, John. I wanted to actually just give a shout out, another libation, add in Nat Turner. I was trying not to go all there with the libation, but yeah, I just want to bring Prophet Nat in here. I have two questions. So first, you referring to the 400-year anniversary, for lack of a better term of it, of Africans being forced. Oh,
That's fine.
say it with my chest as the. So Nat Turner, shout out to Nat Turner. And I wanted about the 400-year anniversary of Africans coming to the U.S., being enslaved. You referred to folks as slaves, and there's this conversation of whether people should be referred to as slaves or enslaved people, enslaved Africans. So I wanted to get first your take on that. And then secondly, you said that blackness was something that was constructed here. And sort of in my own understanding, studies of like Sudan being called the land of the blacks, or Ethiopian land of the burnt skin, or whatever, I forgot the particular translation, just that idea of like blackness being something that's created here, whereas in some form or other, I understood it to have already existed prior to it being constructed through our enslavement here. So just wanted to share that response and ask those as prompts or questions.
Okay, great. So yeah, I think your point about should we talk about people who are enslaved as about people being slave, I think that's a useful move. On the second question, I think when we use, if you think about blackness that's used, 2,000 years ago, it meant something completely different than what it means now. And so the term we use now in terms of black is more, so for example, I sometimes say, born in the United States, I was born a colored boy. And then by the mid-50s, the term shifted. And this is a public, no one asked me, right? I became a Negro. And the first public figure in the United States who was black was Malcolm X. And he was actually stating a political space. He was saying, and as James Baldwin was recently, this film saying, I'm not your Negro, right? It's like, what is he saying? I'm not your Negro. What are you, James Baldwin, if you're not my Negro, right? And so Malcolm is saying, I'm black. And I'm old enough to have lived through those iterations. And I can tell you, the pushback from many whites was like, after calling me black, it's like when I'm a kid, it's like, why are you calling yourself black? You're not black, you're brown. And so Malcolm wasn't saying, right? Malcolm was a light-skinned black person. If he was in Brazil, he wouldn't even be black. But he was taking a political stance. And so blackness as a category, not just as a descriptor. Think about this. Most of you have heard, who study the United States, have heard of Plessy versus Ferguson. How many have heard of that? Okay. Homer Plessy was an octoroon. He was phenotypically white, but he's black. So we're not talking about a descriptor. We're talking about something else. So what people talked about in the Sudan, and at that period, they were talking about descriptors. And it didn't have the political association. It didn't mean you were inferior. It didn't mean you couldn't excel. It didn't mean all the things that has come to mean in terms of the European essentialness of blackness. And it wasn't the fear and the dread of blackness that we associate now. I sometimes jokingly say, one drop of black blood will destroy whiteness.
Yeah.
I say, that black blood, man, that's some powerful stuff. And they said, well, actually, there's no such thing as black blood.
Yeah.
So what are we really talking about? What we really are talking about is white fragility. The whiteness is so thin that if you look at it, it starts to dissipate. And it should, because it's a hoax. It's not real. In terms of genealogy, and a lot of people don't realize this, the most mixed people on the planet are people who are phenotypically referred to as white. Mixed. And even before, when they used to say the average is African American, has 75% of African Americans have 25% white blood, whatever the hell that means. But here's the interesting thing. 54% of whites have 5% black blood. And yet I've never, when I say that, none of my white friends say, oh yeah, that's me. It's like, no one, I mean, they will claim Indian blood, right? I'm Chico, I'm half Cherokee, but none of them say, yeah. Even Thomas Jefferson, right? So part of it is the constructedness, which we have to sort of dig into, and the association. So that's what I mean, blackness. I don't mean phenotypical of blood. I mean the association of blackness with inferior, subhuman, that came out of the Enlightenment period.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your questions. I know there's I can look at these faces and see there are so many more questions, and really we could be here all night. However, we do have another event after this. So I would like to welcome you all, whether you registered or not, to stay for the next event, which will be a documentary showing. And then after that, we will also have some light refreshments, some time to speak to these questions, to speak to one another. If there's somebody in this room that you were hoping to speak to, we hope that you come back and join us, even if you got to go run a little errand. Maybe you'll come back for some light refreshments. We do too hope that you will join us. If you just have an urgent question, maybe you'll be able to catch Professor Powell on his way out. And just thank you all so much. You are going to make this event everything that it is. So. Anything else, Virginia? Good? Okay, well, Fatina wants to tease you a little bit more about this amazing documentary. World premiere, excuse me.
Just a little bit more. First, queridas e queridos, eu estou tão emocionada de ter vocês aqui que meio perdi meu português no início. Então, peço desculpa. Vocês não fazem ideia a emoção, o prazer e a honra que é ter vocês aqui. Estamos sonhando com esse momento e realmente sejam bem-vindos para esse momento aqui. Estamos aguardando muito as parcerias e as trocas no futuro. Então, bem-vindos, muito obrigada por terem vindo.
E aí chegaram os negros, com toda a sua cultura, toda a sua tradição, toda a sua religião. Nunca pense em desistir do que se quer. Os inimigos estão testando a nossa fé. Olhos atentos pra saber como é que é. PANIJE. Nunca pense em desistir do que se quer. Os inimigos estão testando a nossa fé. Olhos atentos pra saber como é que é. PANIJE. O que nos une é muito mais que ideais. É o desejo de louvar os ancestrais. Com a bênção do meu povo e nossos orixás. Com versos marginais, querendo sempre mais. Pra destruir aquele que insiste em nos deter. Pra descobrir todas as formas de sobreviver. Cabelo trançado em